In order to motivate the study of international trade, I'm going to discuss these 5 important facts. International trade is ancient, increasing, embraced by countries to a varying degree, controversial, and greatly advocated by economists. Through your knowledge of history, you might know that international trade is not a modern phenomenon. The ancient Romans were eager traders, and there is evidence that they traveled all the way from Europe to the Pacific coast of Russia. Then there was the famous Silk Route, through which China exported silk to Europe, where it was in much demand. The journey was long and risky, but there were enough profits in it for it to be made. After the founding of Islam, Muslim traders controlled the Indian Ocean and traded as far as the furthest corners of East Asia. The spread of Islam from the Arabic Peninsula to Africa, South Asia, and the Far East greatly overlaps the reach of Muslim traders. And of course, the European adventures to the Americas and India were motivated by the desire to trade. It was to discover a new trade route that Columbus set sail from Spain. And it was also trade that first brought the British to India, which they later colonized. So trade is not a phenomena that is unique to the modern era, though some of the newer forms of transportation and communication are. What is unique to the modern world, though, is the explosion in the volume of international trade. This figure plots the volume of international trade in merchandise, which is thus the trade in goods and not services in the post-war era. The volume of international trade in dollar terms has increased from about $1 trillion in 1948 to about $20 trillion today. You can also see that the increase has been exponential, which means that the biggest increase has happened most recently. In 1980, the year I was born, total volume of trade was about 5 trillion, and today it is about 20 trillion. Now, I like to think that I'm not very old, but I am old enough for the volume of international trade to have increased almost 4-fold in my lifespan. Another way to measure the extent of international trade is to look at a country's sum of exports and imports as a percentage of its total production, or GDP. Such percentage can be thought of as measuring how intensively a country trades with the outside world. The percentages for the major economies are plotted here. Now let's take a look at the green line, which is the percentage for UK. It plots UK's imports and exports as a percentage of its GDP. Now, just before this First World War in 1910, international trade was about 30% of UK's GDP. But in the interwar years, it fell. And after the Second World War, it began to rise again, but it did not reach its 1910 levels until almost the year 2000. So surprisingly, the UK engaged in international trade with the same intensity in the year 2000 as it did in the year 1910. And this is a pattern that we observe in almost all of the major economies here. Trade intensity was high in the beginning of the 20th century. It fell towards the middle of the century, and in the second half of the century regained its lost ground. But it is only in the 21st century that we are seeing levels of trade intensity that we have not seen before. What caused the decline of trade in the interwar era is a topic for another video. But here I do want to discuss why trade volume has increased in the post-war era. First, transportation and communication costs have fallen, particularly since the invention and widespread use of the standardized shipping container since the late 1960s. Now, before the shipping container, goods being shipped abroad had to be packed and unpacked at the beginning and end of each leg of the transit. This was necessary because trucks, rail cars, ships, and airplanes all used containers of different sizes. The standardized shipping container allowed goods to be packed only once, and then, because of its standardized size, could be loaded onto any truck, rail car, ship, or airplane, and it was on its way without having to be opened at each point of transit. This greatly reduced shipping time and costs and provided a boost to international trade. The second reason why trade has increased is because of a worldwide concentrated effort to decrease trade barriers under this treaty called the GATT and later under the WTO. Now those are topics for another video, but here is a time plot of the tariff rates averaged across all countries. A tariff, as you probably know, is a tax on imported goods intended to restrict their volume. The higher the tariff rate, the higher the trade restriction. Now the average tariff rates show a consistent downward trend since the Second World War. The main driver of such reduction has been the belief, embraced by all countries, that openness to international trade is good for peace and economic growth. Now, not all countries are open to international trade to the same extent. We can think of two polar opposites: autarky, a state of affairs in which the government totally prohibits international trade, and free trade, where there are no government restrictions on exports and imports. Now most countries, they are on a continuum between the two polar opposites. Some are closer to one pole than they are to the other. Now North Korea, whose government shuns the outside world, but is unable to completely suppress international trade, is closer to the autarky pole. On the other hand, Hong Kong, which is legendary for its free trade policies, is closer to the free trade pole. If a country changes its economic policies to make itself more open to international trade, we say that a country has engaged in trade liberalization. Liberalization refers to freeing. If a country moves in the opposite direction, however, we say that it is engaging in trade protectionism. So liberalization and protectionism are movements in opposite direction. What we have seen in the post-World War era is a mass movement of countries towards the free trade pole, a massive trade liberalization, which is one of the reasons for the increase in international trade that we have seen. Now, trade liberalization is not without its critics. In fact, few issues draw protesters out on the streets as much as the talk of further trade liberalization. Trade liberalization is often blamed for job losses, environmental degradation, and loss of national sovereignty, among other things. We will consider several of these arguments later on in the course. The opposition to trade liberalization was forcefully brought to the attention of the world by events on the streets of Seattle in December 1999 when thousands of activists for various causes protested outside the WTO ministerial being held in the city. We will be talking about the WTO and its ministerials later on in the course. The Seattle protests turned violent and caused the downtown to shut down for 3 days. There is now even a movie called Battle in Seattle made about the protests. I'm going to show you the trailer here.
It's been 30 years since the Democratic Convention riots of 1968 pitted police and protesters against each other. But some fear history will repeat itself this week in Seattle as the World Trade Organization prepares to hold its first ever meeting on U.S. soil.
We believe that all the protesters will be concentrated there.
How many protesters are we expecting?
Several thousand.
It's taken 2 years to bring the World Trade Organization to Seattle, and we did it.
We've got 13 major intersections downtown, and each of the affinity groups are going to shut these areas down. Now, how are we going to do it?
Not violently.
That's right.
Be tough on your issues, but be gentle on my town.
You probably will not be surprised to learn where economists stand on the question of free trade versus protectionism. A survey in 1990 of economists and general public asked what they thought of this statement over here. Tariffs and quotas, as you probably know, are instruments of trade protectionism. Well, over 90% of economists agreed with the above statement, indicating a support for free trade, while only 66% of the general public did so. The support for free trade declined even further among the general public when they were asked about specific trade policy issues, while the support among economists remained the same. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman has called the belief in free trade as the dividing issue between economists and non-economists. So if you ever find yourself in a cocktail party with economists, don't call them a protectionist. You might get a drink thrown in your face. In this course, you will learn about the reasoning that underlies economists' consensus in support of free trade.